So the next thing we're going to talk about is going to be bypassing access controls. Now again, this is where thinking outside the box comes into play. We have to find a way around this big wall of access control systems. And basically, access controls can be defined in many venues, including user and group membership associated to file-level permissions, application authentication, directory systems such as Active Directory and NDS, LDAP. All these various things exist all over the network. Just about everything that is touched on a corporate network requires some level of access, and therefore is usually configured with some level of access control. Even switches, routers, firewalls, all of these things have built-in access controls that prevent anonymous people or unauthorized people from gaining access to them. Our job is to find holes or vulnerabilities in how those are configured or how they're implemented. So, moral of the story is, our goal is to circumvent those access controls in order to gain entry into a particular system, whether that be a PC, a server, or a printer on the network. So we're going to talk about some of the more popular access controls and how we might be able to circumvent them. First of all, the most popular of all access controls is a username and password combination. We're also going to talk a little bit about smart cards real quick. And smart cards are basically little scan cards, very much like a credit card. And you scan those through a little scanner, and they contain your username and password information, usually assisted with a PIN number or some third factor of authentication. Smart cards are extremely effective. There's one thing to keep in mind, and that's the physical security of your smart cards. So making sure that they don't get stolen and that they're not scanned or compromised is very important. Biometric access methods are definitely better than smart cards and are even sometimes used in combination with smart cards. But one of the problems you're going to find with biometric authentication is that it's so expensive to implement. Most companies with thousands and thousands of users, they just simply don't have the money to implement such an expensive authentication method. In addition to that, it's extremely expensive to maintain in the long haul. So we're going to talk about the first thing about passwords. And because passwords are the most common, they almost inherently are going to be the most insecure, and they actually are. So username password combinations are really tricky and misleading because you would think it's a two-factor authentication when in fact it's not. Passwords are very easy to circumvent, and usernames are practically public knowledge if you're familiar with the naming convention. So at this point, we can pretty much guess a username, or we can gain access to that information relatively easily. So now the trick is to crack the password. And this can be done in numerous different ways, usually using a brute force or dictionary-based cracking attempt. And there are various programs out there to do that. All you've got to do is get that password in one form or another, and chances are you can crack it, or better yet, guess what it is. Social engineering is definitely a very common method for gaining information. A great example of this would be just to call up a user at a particular organization, claim to be the help desk, even better if you have information about their real help desk, and ask them questions. What's your username and password? I need to log on to your system and check for viruses or check for spyware. Most people aren't going to challenge you on that. As a matter of fact, in all the penetration testing and social engineering I've done, I've only had one person ever challenge me over the phone, and that was a secretary. So you can definitely imagine that it's rare that people will ever challenge IT or any sort of authority. Sniffers are another great way to bypass access controls by gaining passwords. A lot of protocols and applications, such as HTTP and FTP, communicate passwords over the wire in plain text. So all we have to do is get on the wire somehow and start pulling those passwords off and utilizing them in any way we see fit. Session hijacking is very similar to sniffing passwords, except we don't even get the password. We don't need it because we take over the entire session. Imagine for a second that person A and person B are really close friends and often exchange very private information. Well, person A walks up to person B and starts off a private conversation. Well, you can walk up and push person A off to the side and assume their identity and imagine that person B would never know the difference. That's a great example of session hijacking. Another thing to keep in mind is a lot of companies and organizations use application user accounts or service user accounts. These are especially vulnerable because they generally don't change their password ever. So that means the password is going to be the same indefinitely, which is great for us because that means it gives us almost an unlimited timeline to crack that password and gain access through that service account. In addition, very often application and service accounts have a very elevated level of permissions across the entire network. Even though they shouldn't, it's a lot easier to configure them that way from an administrative standpoint, so they often do. Incorrectly or loosely populated group membership is also an effective way of bypassing those controls. Oftentimes, users are given significantly more privileges than they need, and all you need is just enough permissions to start populating group memberships or changing those around, and you can have a pretty big effect in bypassing those access controls. In addition, incorrectly configured permissions play right along with that incorrectly configured group membership in that it's often easier to give everyone permission than try to figure out exactly who needs it. So you're going to find that even more frequently the larger company that you deal with.